The call came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon from a number I didn't recognize, a local area code I couldn't immediately place, and a man's voice I had never heard before introducing himself as David Chen, asking if he was speaking with Angela Mercer. I said yes, assuming it was something administrative, the kind of call you get occasionally about insurance or utilities or some piece of paperwork you filled out months ago and forgot about. Then David Chen explained that he was the tenant currently leasing the property on Elmwood Avenue, that his lease was coming up for renewal at the end of the following month, and that he was calling me directly because the original lease agreement he had signed 6 years earlier listed me as the property owner of record, and he wanted to make sure he was communicating with the right person before committing to another term. I set down the glass I was holding very carefully on my kitchen counter. My brother Marcus had been collecting rent on that property every month for 6 years. I had not received a single dollar of it, and the tenant had just told me, without knowing any of this, that my name was on the lease the entire time. My name is Angela, and this is the story of a phone call that a stranger made in good faith that unraveled 6 years of something my brother had been very carefully counting, on me never finding out. My father spent most of his working life building modest, durable things, a small distribution business that employed 100 people, a reputation in the community for straightforward dealing, and a property portfolio that he assembled slowly over 20 years. Purchasing income-generating real estate with the same patient, methodical approach he brought to everything else. By the time his health began declining seriously, he owned 4 rental properties outright, small residential units that generated reliable monthly income, and that he managed himself with the help of a part-time property manager named Ruth who had worked with him for over a decade. My brother Marcus and I had different relationships with our father's business world. Marcus was involved, present, interested in the operational details in ways that made him the natural person to step into day-to-day management as my father's capacity decreased. I was more adjacent, aware of the general picture, consulted occasionally on financial questions that drew on my professional background, but not embedded in the daily running of things the way Marcus was. This division of involvement felt natural and functional for most of the years it operated. Right up until the Thursday afternoon, David Chen called me about his lease. The Elmwood Avenue property was the second rental unit my father had purchased, acquired about 18 years before David Chen's phone call, a well-maintained duplex in a stable residential neighborhood that had consistently attracted reliable long-term tenants across the years my father owned it. My father was proud of that property in the specific way he was proud of things that performed consistently without requiring dramatic intervention. It generated steady income, required modest maintenance, and had appreciated quietly over the years without anyone needing to do much beyond taking care of it properly. About 2 years before his death, during one of the clearer periods of a health decline that had begun producing variable days, my father had a conversation with me about the Elmwood property specifically. We were sitting in his living room on a Sunday afternoon, going through some paperwork he wanted help organizing, and he mentioned the property in a way that felt deliberate rather than incidental. He told me he had always thought of that particular property as something he wanted me to have specifically, not as part of a general estate distribution, but as a direct transfer, because he believed I had the financial background to manage it well, and because its income stream was the kind of stable, reliable asset he thought suited my temperament better than the more operationally complex business assets that would naturally go to Marcus. He said he was going to have Gerald update the property documentation to reflect this intention formally. I told him there was no rush, that we should focus on more immediate things, that the paperwork could happen when he was feeling better. This is one of the things I think about most in retrospect. The conversations where I said there was no rush, because saying there was no rush felt kinder in the moment than acknowledging what the need for rush actually implied about his prognosis. My father died 14 months later. The formal documentation transfer he had described to me that Sunday afternoon had not been completed, but something else had been done, something I didn't know about until David Chen called me, something my father had apparently arranged through Ruth and Gerald at some point during those 14 months without telling me he had done it. My father's death produced the particular combination of grief and administrative complexity that most people who have lost a parent recognize, the simultaneous requirement to feel the loss completely while also processing a significant volume of practical decisions and paperwork that do not pause for grief to run its course. Marcus handled most of the immediate business and property management questions during that period, which made sense given his existing involvement, and given that I was less immediately available in those first weeks, managing my own grief alongside a demanding professional schedule that I had less capacity to set aside than Marcus did at that time. The estate process took several months to complete formally. I was present for the significant legal conversations, reviewed the documentation Gerald prepared, and understood the general distribution of assets as it was structured through my father's will. What I did not do, and what I have thought about many times since David Chen's call, was ask specific, granular questions about each of the 4 rental properties individually, about how they were titled, about what, if any, transfers or arrangements my father had made during his lifetime outside of the formal will process. I understood the general picture. I didn't verify the specific details. This is not an excuse, simply an accurate description of how grief and administrative complexity interact when you are trying to process both simultaneously. Marcus took over management of all 4 properties following the estate settlement, a natural continuation of the role he had been growing into during my father's decline. He provided periodic general updates about the property portfolio as a whole, the kind of high-level summaries that covered occupancy rates and general maintenance without going into specific financial details for individual units. I received these updates with the engaged but not deeply scrutinizing attention of someone who trusts the general picture without auditing the component parts. For 6 years, this arrangement produced nothing that suggested to me anything other than a straightforward continuation of how my father had managed things. The rent checks from Elmwood Avenue went into Marcus's account. Every month for 72 consecutive months, David Chen paid his rent and Marcus deposited it, and I had no awareness that any of it was happening, because nothing in the general picture Marcus presented to me ever created a specific reason to ask about that specific property in any specific detail. David Chen was, I came to understand in the days following his call, exactly the kind of tenant my father had always hoped to attract. Responsible, communicative, careful with the property, consistent with his payments across all 6 years of his tenancy. He had signed his original lease with Ruth, my father's longtime property manager, who had apparently been using the ownership documentation my father had arranged, which listed me as the property owner of record, as the basis for the lease agreement without anyone having updated that documentation to reflect whatever the estate settlement had or hadn't formally transferred. David explained all of this to me during our initial phone call with the patient clarity of someone who understood he had potentially called into a complicated situation and was trying to provide enough context to be genuinely helpful rather than simply technically compliant. He mentioned that he had always dealt with a man named Marcus for day-to-day matters, but that the formal lease paperwork consistently listed me, and that at renewal time he had decided to contact the owner of record directly to confirm everything was properly aligned before committing to another term. After I ended the call with David, I sat at my kitchen counter for a long time before doing anything else. I was not immediately angry, which surprised me slightly in retrospect. What I felt first was something closer to the particular quality of clarity that arrives when a piece of information reorganizes a large number of previously confusing small details into a coherent picture. 6 years of general property updates that never included Elmwood specifically. A couple of occasions when I had asked casually about the individual properties and received answers that had been technically accurate about the others without addressing Elmwood directly. The way Marcus had occasionally mentioned needing to handle a maintenance issue at one of the properties without specifying which one. I called Gerald the following morning. I explained what David Chen had told me and asked Gerald to pull the documentation related to the Elmwood Avenue property specifically. Gerald, characteristically, called me back within 2 hours with the information organized and clear. The property documentation my father had arranged, at some point during the 14 months between our Sunday afternoon conversation and his death, had indeed listed me as the owner of record. This had not been formally transferred or superseded during the estate settlement process, which Gerald acknowledged should have been caught and addressed at that time, and for which he offered an apology that was genuine and that I accepted because Gerald's thoroughness across decades of working with my father, made the oversight genuinely surprising rather than typical. The rent from Elmwood Avenue across 6 years of David Chen's tenancy, at the rate documented in the lease agreements, represented a significant sum that had been deposited into Marcus's account rather than mine, based on an arrangement that had no legal basis in the ownership documentation on record. I did not call Marcus immediately. I spent several days reviewing everything Gerald provided, understanding the full picture clearly before having a conversation that I knew would be difficult and that I wanted to approach with complete information rather than partial understanding and high emotion. During those days, I also spoke with a property attorney Gerald recommended, who confirmed the ownership situation and helped me understand what my options were and what a reasonable resolution might look like. Then I called my brother. The conversation with Marcus was one of the most difficult I have ever had, not because it was loud or hostile, but because of what it required both of us to be honest about simultaneously. Marcus's explanation was not simple, and I don't think it was entirely dishonest. He told me that in the chaos of the estate settlement, he had assumed the Elmwood property had transferred through the estate along with the others, that he had not specifically checked the ownership documentation for each property individually, and that by the time the first rent check arrived from David Chen and went into his account without complication, he had simply continued a pattern that appeared to be working without examining the legal basis for it carefully enough. I asked him, at one point during that conversation, whether there had been a moment where he had checked and understood that the documentation showed my name and continued anyway. He was quiet for a moment before answering. He said there had been a moment, about 18 months in, when he had seen the documentation while handling a maintenance matter and had recognized that it showed my name, and had told himself he would sort it out properly, and had then not done so. He did not offer an excuse for those 4.5 years after that moment. He said he understood that the absence of excuse was appropriate. The formal resolution of the Elmwood Avenue situation took about 3 months to complete, involving conversations between Gerald, the property attorney, Marcus and me, and eventually a financial accounting that covered the full 6 years of rental income. Marcus repaid the full amount, not all at once but through a structured arrangement that Gerald helped formalize, which I accepted because demanding it all immediately would have created hardship without serving any purpose beyond the demand itself. And I was not interested in hardship as a goal, only in accuracy as an outcome. David Chen renewed his lease. After I confirmed with him directly that the ownership situation had been clarified and that he could continue in the property with full confidence in the stability of his tenancy. He was gracious about the whole thing in the way of someone who had made a phone call in good faith and found that good faith had produced useful results, which it had, though not in any way he had specifically intended or anticipated. Marcus and I have continued to have a relationship since those months. Not the same as before, but present and functional in ways that matter to me more than they might if I had simply cut contact and considered the matter closed. We worked through things in Gerald's office that needed to be worked through, and we have found, in the year since, a level of directness with each other that we probably should have had for years and simply hadn't. I don't think Marcus is a bad person. I think he made a series of decisions across 6 years that compounded on each other in ways that became increasingly difficult to reverse cleanly, and that the moment of reversal, when it came, arrived from a direction nobody in our family had anticipated. A tenant acting in good faith, calling the name on a lease, asking a simple question about a renewal. I think about my father often, about the Sunday afternoon conversation in his living room where he described wanting me to have Elmwood specifically, about the documentation he apparently arranged in the months that followed without telling me he had done it, about the gap between intention and formal completion that created the conditions for everything that followed. I don't think my father would have been surprised that things got complicated. He understood, better than most people I have known, that the distance between intending something and completing it properly is where most significant problems eventually locate themselves. He was someone who tried to close that distance carefully and consistently in his own work, which is why the framed original warehouse lease hung behind his desk for 30 years, a reminder that the beginning of something, properly documented and fully understood, is the foundation everything else depends on. I keep a copy of the Elmwood Avenue ownership documentation in a folder I can locate without searching. Not because I expect to need it urgently, but because I understand now, in a way I didn't before David Chen's phone call, that knowing precisely what is yours and what the paperwork actually says about it is not a paranoid or untrusting orientation toward the people you love. It is simply accurate. And accuracy, as I have had occasion to learn more than once in my life, is almost always worth the effort it requires, regardless of what the less accurate version of things might have been more comfortable believing for a while longer.